My name is Paula Palmer, and I'm a member of the Indigenous Peoples' Concerns Committee at the Quaker meeting in Boulder, Colorado. For the past several years, I have been working as director of a project or ministry called Toward Right Relationship with America's Native Peoples. And in the course of this work, I met Geraldine Dakota, and through her, I began learning about the Indian boarding schools. In a few moments, we will be offering a presentation about the role that Quakers played in conceptualizing, promoting, and managing the Indian boarding schools. But first, I'd like you to meet Geraldine. Geraldine is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and she chairs the board of directors of a coalition of Native American organizations that is working to bring about healing for Native people who continue to suffer the consequences of the policy of forced assimilation of Native children. Geraldine, please tell us about the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, why it was formed, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Well, first of all, thank you, Paula, for that very kind introduction. So, as the name implies, this is a healing coalition that is comprised of individuals and tribes and organizations, both Indian and non-Indian, who are seeking to have healing from the intergenerational trauma from the boarding school policy, from the effects of the boarding school policy. So in order to accomplish that, of course, is a long road. So we're hoping to educate people and ourselves about the history of the boarding school policy and its impacts on those who were taken away to attend these schools and on the tribal communities that they returned home to, sometimes many, many years later. So this is the story of individuals and a policy that was left out of history books. You won't find these stories in history books. These are stories that haven't been told before. So we want to tell these stories to begin to tell the truth about the boarding school policy and what happened. And the whole point is so that healing can begin. And the healing that we're looking for is community-directed healing, healing that tribes and Indian communities themselves would define as being appropriate for their individuals and their tribal communities. So the effects of the boarding school policy are pretty evident in some pretty sad statistics that we hear when we talk about Native communities. Alcoholism, illness such as diabetes, suicide rates that are many times the incidence in just the general population. So lots of really sad statistics. When you look behind these, you see what has happened in these boarding schools and what has happened since these folks came home. So we expect the United States government and churches, because they both played integral roles in implementing this policy, we expect them to acknowledge the role that they played and to take responsibility and to help in the healing process. Not because we want to point fingers and lay blame, but because we think that it's important to heal not just the Native communities, but the relationship between the Native communities and the non-Native communities. So this is important for all of us.
Would you like to share something of your own family story with the boarding schools?
Yes. Yes, I would. So both my parents attended boarding schools, as did my mother's mother, so my grandmother, although I didn't learn much about that. My mother and father actually met in boarding school, even though they were both from the same reservation. They didn't get to know each other until they were in boarding school, and they ended up marrying at the end of their boarding school career. But my mother's story perhaps is most compelling because she went to boarding school when she was 6 years old and didn't come home till she was 12. And of course she didn't speak any English when she started school. And she didn't speak. We didn't know to ask her questions about boarding school. She told us some things like, "Oh, I'll make you scrub that floor with a toothbrush." or I'll make you kneel on a broom handle if you don't behave. And of course she never did those things to us, but it let us know at least that she had experienced or at least observed these things. She died quite young from breast cancer and left 8 kids behind. Some of us grown, some of us still at home. And so the things that we had to learn about her, we had to learn later from other people and by asking questions. So, you know, there are mixed results of boarding schools. But the overarching thing that is important not to forget is that the whole point was to destroy Native culture and language and ceremony and dress and names, everything that there was Indian about a person. And I would say they were fairly successful in my family's case. So as you look at me today, you will see a fairly assimilated person. You don't see an Indian person. Of course, I'm half Indian, so I look half white, or maybe all white. So I look like the people in this community, and I've lived in the Boulder community for over 30 years now. And you might see a successful Indian lawyer in front of you because I am highly educated, highly assimilated, and outward appearances, I'm kind of like everyone else in this community. What you don't see is the loss. You don't see the loss of culture, the loss of language. Language hit me hard. I love language. And I realized early on that that's a real window to culture. It's the fabric of culture. And in one generation, both my parents going to boarding school, not speaking any English and coming out, you know, and never teaching us Indian language. Our language is, in my family, gone. It's not going to come back for me. It's not. So there are other things that I need to do to heal or to promote healing in my own family and in other tribal communities. What you also don't see is the broken bonds between parent and child. My mother wasn't parented. She lived in a very militaristic kind of regime in a boarding school, and that's the way we lived. So not a lot of affection. I don't remember a hug. I do remember a kiss, one kiss, right here, when I was going to an overnight camp, just one night, but she gave me a kiss there, and I still feel that kiss to this day. So what you don't see is all those losses and the damage to our families, which also results in damage to community. You also don't see that the frustration of having to leave my home community to get an education, to find a place to live, to find a job, to have to leave my culture behind and become part of another culture because there's really nothing for me on a reservation. So those are the things that are invisible. I also had to leave to become accepted by society. So I live here quite happily. I love it here in Boulder, but there's a big empty hole in my heart for what we lost. And I'm going to do my best through the Healing Coalition to help communities find their own ways to heal from the damage. And some families were far less lucky than ours, in the way that their lives and situations turned out. So yeah, the Healing Coalition gives me great hope and gives me great satisfaction. So I'd like to be heard.
Thank you so much, Jerry.
And I appreciate the work that Paul has done to learn about the Quaker role in boarding schools. It's so important, and it's a very important part of what the Healing Coalition is asking for. So she's responded to that beautifully, wonderfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. This presentation is called The Quaker Indian Boarding Schools, Facing Our History and Ourselves. It is intended primarily for Quaker audiences, although others are certainly welcome. At the conclusion, I'll suggest some queries for friends to reflect on individually or in groups. 2 people will join me in giving the presentation. Geraldine Dakota, whom you met earlier, is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. She chairs the board of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Geraldine will be reading direct quotations of Native people throughout the presentation. Jane Westberg is a member of the Indigenous Peoples Concerns Committee of the Boulder Friends meeting. She will be reading direct quotations of Quakers throughout the presentation. The reason I conducted this research is because Native American organizations are asking for it. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is working to bring healing to Native American individuals, families, and communities that continue to suffer debilitating consequences of the policy of forced assimilation that was carried out by means of the Indian boarding schools. Healing processes are already underway, as Geraldine spoke of earlier, in some Native communities, emerging from each community's own healing traditions and responding to their needs. But for healing to occur on a larger scale, the Boarding School Healing Coalition is also proposing and promoting a national truth and reconciliation process. You may know that Canada recently completed such a process for their residential schools. The Canadian government's report called their residential school system cultural genocide and prescribed actions to be taken at all levels of government and civil society to compensate First Nations peoples and to support healing. Canada's actions are in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which states in Article 8,
Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Nation states shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for any action which has the aim or the effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct peoples or of their cultural values or ethnic identities.
In our country, the Boarding School Healing Coalition is hoping to bring about a truth, reconciliation, and healing process that can serve as such a mechanism to redress the harm caused by the policy of forced assimilation. The first step in truth, reconciliation, and healing is truth-telling. The coalition is asking churches to bring forward our truth, the truth of the church's participation in the boarding school era. This is the piece of work that I have begun on behalf of Quakers. As far as we know, I'm the first person to undertake this research on behalf of a Christian denomination that was involved in the Indian boarding schools. The coalition hopes other churches will follow. For me, as a Quaker, this history is interesting in itself, but more than that, it lifts a mirror to the religious society of Friends today. 150 years ago, Friends responded to the injustices inflicted upon Native peoples in ways that did some good and much more harm than they knew. My purpose is not to judge these Friends of the 19th and 20th centuries. Rather, my question is for Friends today. Knowing what we know now about the harm that was done, how will we respond to the ongoing suffering in Native communities and to the need for healing now? My research has been in two phases. First was a 2-week field research trip in August 2015 when I visited the sites of 11 Quaker Indian schools in Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. Guthrie Miller of Santa Fe Friends Meeting accompanied me on this trip in the Quaker tradition of spiritual accompaniment. His spiritual, logistical, and musical support made all the difference as we traveled. The field research was followed by 4 months of bibliographic research in the Friends Historical Library at Swarthmore College and in Haddeford College's Quaker History Collection. These libraries hold a wealth of primary sources, letters and journals written by Quaker teachers, minutes of Quaker meetings, Quaker publications, and other periodicals. What is largely missing, however, are the authentic voices of Native people. Almost anything that was published in the 19th and early 20th centuries was published by white editors who applied whatever criteria they pleased. They generally sustained their own biases. Public statements by Native people in their own languages had to be translated, and it's hard to know how accurately this was done. I made a concerted effort to bring forward the authentic voices of Native people from that time, but it's important to be aware of the limitations. I'll give you a little taste now of my field research trip last August with some then and now photos. These are the families of Quaker teachers at the Kansa Indian School. Note the school building in the background. I took this picture of the remnants of the Kansa Indian School last August outside Council Grove, Kansas. This is the Quaker Indian boarding school for Oto and Missouri children in Nebraska. And this is a remnant of that building, which has been preserved by a local historical society in Barneston, Nebraska. This is Fort Sill Indian School, where Quakers taught Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache children. This is what remains today of the boys' dormitory at Fort Sill Indian School. This is the Kickapoo Friends Mission and School, built by Quaker teacher Elizabeth Test in the early 1890s with her own money. This is now the home of Brad and Christine Wood, evangelical Quaker missionaries at Kickapoo Friends Center. Brad's parents served as missionaries here, so he grew up in this house. His wife, Christine, is Kickapoo. I've identified plus or minus 30 Quaker Indian schools that operated for periods of time between the year 1796 and 2006, a span of 210 years. Some of these were day schools, and some were boarding schools. And I have to say plus or minus because it depends on how you count them. For example, there was friend Thomas Batty who kept trying to gather children in his tent while they traveled across the prairie with Chief Kickingbird's band of Kiowas. Should we count his efforts as a school? Some of the schools changed locations. Some of them changed names. Some of them started as day schools and evolved into boarding schools, and vice versa. Some of them were in operation only a few months. The longest run in New York was 86 years. I've divided the Quaker Indian school experience into 3 time periods: before the Ulysses S. Grant administration, during the Grant administration from 1869 to 1877, and then after the Grant administration. The Grant presidency is the key to this chronology because under President Grant, Quakers were hired to serve as Indian agents and to manage Indian boarding schools as direct employees of the federal government. This official collaboration sets the Grant administration apart from the earlier and later periods. So let's start with the first period, before the Grant administration from 1796 to 1868. The first Quaker Indian schools were in New York, where Friends worked among the Oneida, Stockbridge, and Seneca peoples. In 1791, Seneca chief corn planter wrote to Philadelphia Quakers,
"We cannot teach our children what we perceive their situation requires them to know, and we therefore ask you to instruct some of them. We wish them to be instructed to read and to write and such other things as you teach your own children, and especially teach them to love peace."
In response, yearly meetings sent small groups of Friends to live first among the Oneidas and then the Senecas. They opened day schools for both girls and boys that operated for a few years among the Oneidas and several decades among the Senecas. In his review of this period, friend Raynor Kelsey wrote,
"These schools were not greatly appreciated by the Indians and often had very few scholars, the boys' school even being entirely without attenders at some periods."
Seneca attitudes toward the Quakers fluctuated. At times, the people divided into pro-Quaker and anti-Quaker camps. In 1851, Orthodox Friends decided to build a boarding school so that they wouldn't have to, in Kelsey's words, depend on the caprice of the Indian children and their parents for attendance. In the boarding school, in addition to their classroom lessons, The boys were taught farming and industrial skills, and the girls were taught homemaking. Their labor contributed to the maintenance of the farm and the dormitories. Teacher Susan Wood expressed the school's intent in a letter dated May 26, 1853.
We are satisfied it is best to take the children when small, and then if kept several years, they would scarcely, I think, return to the indolent and untidy ways of their people.
This was the greatest fear of the Quaker teachers, that in spite of their efforts, the children might, quote, lapse hopelessly into the old, shiftless, savage life. Again, in the words of friend Rainer Kelsey. The Tunasasa boarding school was in operation from 1852 to 1938, an 86-year run, which was the longest by far among the Quaker Indian schools. Quakers believed in education. They had been building schools for their own children for centuries. They were very concerned that Native people could be cheated and would be cheated by corrupt government officials and land-hungry, alcohol-toting settlers and traders if they could not speak or understand English. Quakers frequently accompanied the Senecas to treaty conferences to be sure that they understood the proceedings and the documents. Their schools emphasized the teaching of English language and literacy, along with elementary arithmetic and geography. Students who memorized entire chapters of the Bible were held in highest regard by their Quaker teachers. In the Haverford College Quaker collection, I held in my hands a ledger book from the Tunasasa boarding school. Teachers recorded the students' names, their parents' names, their addresses and enrollment dates, and there was a column for observations. Some of the observations read,
Ran away 4th time, married a white man, sent home for persistent disobedience, went home when father died, went to Carlisle, taken to Buffalo Hospital for TB treatment, graduated with honors, killed on the railroad when drunk, expelled for immorality, unable to adapt herself.
In the early 1800s, members of Baltimore Yearly Meetings Indian Committee began visiting the Shawnee people in Ohio at the request of their chiefs. Several friends stayed for periods of time to build grist mills and offer instruction in farming and animal husbandry. By 1822, they had built a school near Wapakoneta. They boarded an average of 10 to 15 Shawnee students there over a 9-year period until the Shawnee were forced to move west under the terms of the 1831 treaty. The Quakers vigorously protested the forced removal of the Shawnees from Ohio and also the Senecas from New York. Thanks in part to their efforts, the Senecas retained 2 out of 4 of their New York reservations. Failing to prevent the Shawnees' removal from Ohio, the Quakers followed them to Kansas and built a boarding school for them there just across the Missouri River. During the first half of the 19th century, Christian missionaries from all the denominations fanned out across the West, establishing missions and schools, partially supported with funds allocated by the federal government to, quote, civilize and Christianize the Indians. This was the common terminology, civilize and Christianize, and it was the common goal of the churches and the government. I hope you can hear the quotation marks around the words because I will be saying them a lot throughout this talk. For the other denominations, the first goal was to Christianize, to save souls. So they got busy learning native languages, translating the Bible, and converting native people to Christianity. By contrast, the Quakers' first priority was to civilize. They believed, in biblical terms, that the ground must be prepared before the seed is sown. A Quaker teacher to the Caddos and Kiowas, Thomas Batty, wrote,
It has long been my opinion that to present the sublime doctrines of the gospel to these untutored people without a preliminary work of preparation having been first accomplished, might be comparable to casting pearls before swine or sowing good seed on the stony ground. It would not be likely to be productive of the best results.
For the Quakers, preparing the ground meant changing everything about the native people's ways of life. Their dwellings, their sustenance, their clothes, their hair, their language, their gender roles, their economy, their names, their marital practices. Everything, says Quaker historian Thomas Ham of Earlham College, except their religion. The question of which should come first, Christianizing or civilizing, played out in the mission schools, where some of the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Catholics began teaching in their students' own languages. The Quakers insisted on English immersion, believing it to be a necessary prerequisite for the planting of the seed. Now we'll move into the period of the Grant presidency, after the Civil War, from 1869 to 1877. Upon his election, President Grant initiated a new policy toward Native peoples, which he called the peace policy, or sometimes the Quaker policy. Quakers actually proposed this policy to Grant before he was inaugurated. Their goal was to end the Indian wars west of the Mississippi, call back the cavalry, and spare the lives of both Indians and settlers. The government would make peace with tribes that agreed to live on reservations, give up hunting, take up farming, and send their children to school. These conditions were written into the treaties. In exchange, the government would guarantee the tribe's security and deliver commodities and annuity payments on a regular schedule. President Grant would appoint Christian men, nominated by the churches, to serve as Indian agents on the reservations, ending the notoriously corrupt system of political patronage. The Indian agents would enforce the treaties and facilitate the work of, again, Christianizing and civilizing the native people. Quakers participated enthusiastically in carrying out the peace policy. By this time, the Religious Society of Friends had split into Hicksite and Orthodox factions. President Grant appointed Hicksite Friends as Indian agents on 6 reservations in Nebraska, and Orthodox Friends as agents on 10 reservations in Kansas and Indian Territory. Another 57 reservations came under the authority of other Christian denominations. The Quaker agents hired Quaker teachers, both men and women, and they immediately started building schools. During the Grant administration, Quakers managed at least 25 schools on the western reservations. As I said earlier, it's hard to know how to count them since some changed names and locations or were in operation sporadically. Some were day schools, but most were boarding schools. Enrollments in the Quaker schools ranged between 10 and 90 students, and attendance averaged around 65% of those who enrolled. The percentage of school-aged children whose parents enrolled them in schools varied widely among the different tribes. At the end of the Grant administration, 650 children were enrolled in the Hicksite schools in Nebraska, and 1,000 children attended Orthodox schools in Kansas and Indian Territory. Quakers much preferred and promoted the concept of the manual labor boarding schools, also called industrial boarding schools. In 1870, a visiting delegation from Ohio and Genesee yearly meetings reported,
"It is the opinion of all the Quaker agents that the industrial school is the best adapted to the wants of the Indians. They will then be removed from the contaminating influence of the home circle, where they lose at night the good impressions that have been received during the day."
In the industrial schools, students spent half days in classrooms and half days working on the school's farms and in the dormitories and kitchens. Thus, they would learn practical skills and also contribute their labor for the maintenance of the schools. Many Native parents saw this practice as demeaning and would not send their children to these schools. Wilson Hobbs, a Quaker teacher at the Shawnee boarding school in Kansas, complained,
"The boys did not like to work, and the hardest part of my duty was to keep them at it."
Malin Stubbs, a Quaker teacher with the Kansa people in central Kansas, confessed that he spent more time chasing after boys who ran away from their labors than in the classroom teaching them. Think about what these schools were demanding of the children. For centuries, Native men had been warriors and hunters. Women had been gardeners and gatherers. In the manual labor schools, the boys were forced to do the farming, women's work, and the girls were brought indoors from the gardens to the kitchens and sewing rooms. The children were required to overturn the gender roles of their tribes in a single generation. Quakers were very hard on Native men who resisted becoming farmers. They described them as idle, lazy, good for nothing. They put the whole burden of accomplishing the gender role transformation on the children. Wilson Hobbs, teacher at the Shawnee Mission boarding school in Kansas, gives this glimpse of a child's first day at school.
"The service to a new pupil was to trim his hair closely, then with soap and water to give him or her the first lesson in godliness, which was a good scrubbing and a little red precipitate on the scalp to supplement the use of a fine-toothed comb. Then he was furnished with a suit of new clothes and taught how to put them on and off. They all emerged from this ordeal as shy as peacocks just plucked."
For a child's perspective on this experience, we have The School Days of an Indian Girl, written in 1900 by Sekala Sab, a Lakota woman who entered White's Institute, a Quaker boarding school in Indiana, at age 8. She wrote,
I remember being dragged out, though I resisted by kicking and scratching wildly. In spite of myself, I was carried downstairs and tied fast in a chair. I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. Our mothers had taught us that only unskilled warriors who were captured had their hair shingled by the enemy. Among our people, short hair was worn by mourners and shingled hair by cowards. I moaned for my mother, but no one came to comfort me, for now I was only one of many little animals driven by a herder.
In his book, From the Deep Woods to Civilization, the Lakota physician Charles Eastman remembers the humiliation he felt in the Santee School in Nebraska.
We youthful warriors were held up and harassed with those little words, rat, cat, and so forth, until not a semblance of our native dignity and self-respect was left.
Another common Quaker practice was giving the children English names. In one of her first letters home after becoming a teacher on the Iowa reservation in Nebraska, Mary B. Lightfoot wrote,
"Tell H&C I've named 2 little boys for them. I'm giving them English names as I cannot think of learning theirs. I have named several children after friends in the East. When I get through, I will send you a list."
Friend Albert Green visited the Iowa reservation several decades after his stint as a Quaker Indian agent in Nebraska. Among the Iowas, he met whole families named Lightfoot, Hallowell, Folk, Green, and other prominent Quaker surnames. The same names, he said, as one would find in the meeting houses of Philadelphia. What did this renaming mean to the children? In his memoir called The Names, N. Scott Momaday writes about the origin and meaning of his Kiowa name.
My name is Soatali. I am, therefore, Soatali. Therefore, I am. The storyteller Podluck gave me the name Soatali. He believed that a man's life proceeds from his name, in a way that the river proceeds from its source. I am.
By taking away the children's I am, the Quaker teachers forced them to give up their very identity. Joseph Webster, the Quaker agent among the Santee Sioux, put it succinctly.
The whole character of the Indian must be changed.
In the Quaker schools, students would not be allowed to speak their own languages, wear their own clothes, answer to their own names, participate in tribal dances and ceremonies, or go on the buffalo hunts with their families. The Quakers saw it as an either-or situation. You are Indian, or you are civilized. These were mutually exclusive categories. Of course, Native people resisted. Peter Nabokov quotes a Kickapoo father telling a Quaker school recruiter,
"Take that axe and knock him on the head. I will gladly bury him. I would rather you do that than take him to school."
Indeed, when the government built a school on the Kickapoo reservation, the people moved as far away from it as they could and rebuffed the efforts of the Quaker teacher Elizabeth Test for years. She wrote impassioned letters imploring the means to compel Kickapoo parents to send their children to school even against their will. In 1894, she wrote,
I know it will sadly grieve Kickapoo parents to part with their children, but every day's delay is a great loss to them. There is not one of their whole number who can speak English. In this condition, they are already surrounded by whites, are being defrauded of the little money that they have, are tempted continually with strong drink, and are not disciplined to resist temptation. They often yield, and many who are not guilty are arrested and carried off to jail. Their ignorance renders them helpless.
Feeling similar urgency for the Native children to be educated, at least 2 Quaker Indian agents threatened to withhold a family's food rations if their children were not enrolled in school. Gradually, most parents acquiesced, as did Kansas Chief Alegawaho, who said in 1871,
"White men are all around us, and we are cramped and pressed on every hand. I believe my people will soon be impoverished. This I do not want to see. This is the darkest period in our history."
He then enrolled his son in the Quaker school. The child would become the first Kansas chief known by an English name, Albert Taylor. The federal government paid most of the teachers' salaries, usually around $500 a year. Most of these funds were taken out of the tribe's annuity payments that had been established in the treaties. Some teachers were paid by Quaker meetings and organizations in the Midwest and on the East Coast. For years, John Watson and his daughter Eva invested their own salaries into improvements at the Hillside Mission Boarding School in Skytook, Oklahoma. Many teachers wrote heartbreaking letters back to their friends on the East Coast, describing the impoverished state of the Indian populations, and especially the children, who on many reservations were dying of exposure, starvation, and illness. Quaker meetings and organizations raised money year after year and sent literally tons of cloth, clothing, school, and farming supplies to the Quaker-run Indian agencies in the West. Friends kept meticulous accounts of these donated items, down to the last thimble. Hicksite Friends alone, during the Grant administration, raised over $83,000 for the agencies in Nebraska. The Friends who answered the call to serve as teachers did so at some risk to themselves and their families. During the Grant presidency, the Utes, Modocs, Kiowas, Comanches, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Nez Perce peoples were still at war with the United States. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defeated Custer at Little Bighorn in 1876 during Grant's second term. The Nez Perce chief Joseph finally surrendered in 1877. There was fighting between some of the tribes too, especially as the buffalo, so critical for their survival, became scarce. During President Grant's first term, U.S. cavalrymen and commercial hunters killed 5 million buffalo on the Great Plains, bringing the species nearly to extinction. The Quaker families, as well as the reservation-bound Indians, were vulnerable to crop failures, prairie fires, droughts, blizzards, malaria, and tuberculosis. Several Quaker couples buried one or more of their children in the dusty cemeteries behind the meeting houses. Some teachers used their own paychecks to purchase medicines, food, and clothing when the tribe's annuities didn't arrive. Teacher Elizabeth Test camped in a tent for months in order to nurse Kickapoo elders back to health. A Kickapoo child whom Teacher Test had adopted at age 3 and raised remembered,
On long drives in her buggy, Teacher would awaken suddenly and check the reins, stopping right in the middle of the road, saying, "Whoa, whoa, where are we?" I never understood the fatigue that came over her with the long, busy days. Winter or summer, rain or shine, never too cold or too hot to make the weekly visits to the Indians scattered for miles about. She slept in their wickiups and took care of the sick and those in need.
Some of the Quaker teachers stayed a year, fulfilled their contract, and left. Others stayed until the end of their lives and are buried in cemeteries among the graves of their native students. One such friend was Rachel Kirk, who wrote,
The work of friends among the Indians lies nearer my heart than anything else. It has been the greatest part of my life for 16 years. I have given up everything to it.
After the Grant administration, Quakers gradually turned the schools over to the federal government or closed them. The administration of Rutherford B. Hayes was less sympathetic to the Christian Indian agents and refused to appoint the men that Friends nominated. In 1885, the last Hicksite Indian agent in Nebraska resigned, bringing to an end the involvement of Hicksite Quakers in the schooling of Native children. In Oklahoma Territory, Orthodox Friends turned some of their schools over to the federal government. Riverside Indian School in Anadarko, which was founded by Friends in 1871, is still in operation today under the Bureau of Indian Education, with an all-Indian teaching staff and 550 students. I visited there last August. The Quaker school in Shawneetown was converted into an Indian sanatorium for tuberculosis patients. The government expanded the Quaker Seneca boarding school in Wyandotte, Oklahoma, and kept it running until 1980. Evangelical Friends taught Bible classes at the Wyandotte school until it closed. They also gave the students Christmas gifts that were donated by monthly meetings across the country. Unlike the Hicksites, Orthodox Friends stayed in Oklahoma Territory and shifted their emphasis from education to more general missionary work, evangelizing, building meeting houses, holding meetings for worship and Sabbath schools, and teaching farming and household skills to the adult men and women who would accept it. With passage of the Dawes Act in 1887, Native peoples lost their communal lands and were forced onto individual plots called allotments. All the unallotted land was opened up to white settlers who poured into Oklahoma. By 1895, Native tribes throughout the West had lost 2/3 of their land. In Oklahoma Territory, the Quaker Indian schools filled up with white children. As public schools became available, the Quakers closed their mission schools. Eva Watson at the Hillside School in Skiatook, Oklahoma, was the last to do so in 1913. But outside Oklahoma, Orthodox Friends started some new ventures in Indian education. In Indiana and Iowa, boarding schools that were endowed by the Quaker philanthropist Josiah White had been built to house and educate poor children and orphans. In the early 1880s, the government contracted with these whites manual labor institutes to take in native children from the western tribes. The government paid $167 per student per year. Quaker organizations subsidized the education of additional native children in the whites institutes, bringing enrollment to 130 native students in 1885. In the 1890s, for financial and ethical reasons, the Quaker managers decided to end their relationship with the federal government. They transferred the Indian students to other schools and went back to serving non-Indian student populations. In the 1880s, Orthodox Friends also managed 5-day schools and established a boarding school on the Eastern Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina. After 12 years of Quaker management, the government took over the boarding school and kept it running until 1954. In Alaska, Quaker missionaries established missions and schools among the Quake, Tlingit, and Kotzebue native peoples. By 1920, these schools were handed over to other Christian missions or to the government. In the 1880s, while Quakers were gradually laying down their own schools in the West, they enthusiastically supported the government's off-reservation schools, like the famous or infamous Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Several Quakers served as teachers at Carlisle, and many Quaker families in Pennsylvania boarded Carlisle students during the summer months, putting them to work on their farms and in their households. The students' experiences in this so-called outings program varied. Some felt they were being used as slave labor. Others formed lifelong friendships with their host families. It's worth pointing out here a few differences between the off-reservation government boarding schools like Carlisle and the Quaker boarding schools. The Quaker schools were much smaller. Except in the case of the Whites Institutes, they were located on the reservations, which means that most of the children knew each other and spoke the same language. Their parents delivered them to the school, under coercion, certainly, but at least the parents knew where their children were and could visit them at any time. The separation was not as extreme as it was in the off-reservation schools. I found no evidence of physical or sexual abuse in the Quaker schools, although I'm not sure where such evidence would be recorded if it had occurred. The Quaker schools were highly disciplined, but they were not run on the military model that governed Carlisle. The goals of the Quaker schools and the off-reservation government schools were the same, however: to assimilate native children and eliminate native cultures. Now, to quickly complete the chronology of Quaker Indian schools, I'll mention the most recent schools: a boarding school at the Rough Rock Friends Mission on the Navajo Nation, which was run by the Rocky Mountain Yearly Meeting of Evangelical Friends for just a few years in the 1950s, and Friends United Meeting provided a school for Moa Choctaw children in Alabama from 1987 to 2006. These schools were not part of the forced assimilation program. Their goals and their impacts on the Native communities were quite different from the earlier schools. So going back now to the height of Quaker involvement in Indian education, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, how did Quakers at that time assess their accomplishments in the Indian schools? They could boast of some star students, some of whom became defenders of the Indian boarding schools and proponents of assimilation. For example, the Lakota Childs at Kalasa attended White's Labor Industrial School in Indiana and Earlham College, and went on to become a renowned author whose stories appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. She taught music classes for a time at Carlisle, but in some of her writing, she bitterly criticized the treatment that Indian children received in the boarding schools, without mentioning the names of the schools. Steamboat Frank Modoc became the first full-blooded Native American Quaker minister. His conversion was brought about by his daughter,
who attended the Quaker Modoc School. Frank Modoc was an influential preacher among his people, and the Modoc meeting became the largest Quaker meeting in Oklahoma Territory. Myra Fry, named after a New England friend, is the Kickapoo child who was raised by teacher Elizabeth Test. She had a brief career as a vaudeville singer and then founded Loanza Teepee, a cultural center for Native Americans in Los Angeles under the care of California Yearly Meeting. In 1950, in a remembrance of teacher Test, Myra wrote,
"When I am faced with decisions to make, I find I try to decide through how teacher would have done."
But most Quaker teachers despaired of having any lasting impact on their students. Wilson Hobbs, who taught at Shawnee Mission School in Kansas, sent some of his most promising students to Ohio and Indiana to extend their education in hopes of grooming them to become teachers. But he complained,
The Indian traits were never sufficiently stamped out of any of them to make suitable examples for the children.
Ann Kent, who was teaching in the Iowa Indian boarding school, despaired that all the Iowa girls fell back into the ways of their people once they left school. She begged Philadelphia friends to find a place in the East for her 14-year-old star student, Mary Dorian. Mary seemed proud of her achievements in school. At Friends Historical Library, I held in my hands a letter that Mary wrote to her former teacher, Mary B. Lightfoot, in November 1876.
"Dear friend, I wish you would come to see us. You don't know how glad we would be to see you. I can wash clothes, wash dishes, and scrub floors, tables, and benches, and I can sew on the machine. I made a dress for myself, a whole dress, last summer. In school, I can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, long division, and compound numbers. And I am studying geography and mental arithmetic." From your friend, Mary L. Dorian.
The new teacher, Miss Kent, hoped that Mary could be saved from the fate of the other Iowa girls. She wrote to friends in Philadelphia,
It's very distasteful to me to have Mary go back to the Indian life, as all the educated women here have done, and I feel that she will not be an exception if she remains here.
A year later, Superintendent Barclay White confirmed the teacher's fears. Mary had, he wrote, left the Iowa home, cast off citizen's dress, and clad herself in Indian costume. Superintendent White thought he knew why Mary had left. A visiting native girl her own age had shamed Mary for her white clothes and manners and told her she wasn't Indian anymore. Mary had to choose, and she chose home. This photograph shows Iowa children in Mary B. Lightfoot's school, but the children are unnamed on the back of the photo, so we don't know if Mary Dorian is among them. To some degree, every tribesperson had to face the question of how white to become, wrote Peter Nabokov. No matter how much schooling the children completed in white society, they would never be white. In Native society, could they ever be Native again? Many children were deprived of the precious years of bonding with their families. They didn't learn the stories, songs, dances, games, and skills of their people. Some didn't even have a name. The Choctaw poet H. Lee Corrales writes in the voice of a student who returns from boarding school,
"You're an Indian," my father said to me. "Go, dance with them." He pushed my small body into the smiling rhythms, but I did not know them, or my name. I remember his disappointment as I walked away from the crowd, embarrassed by his words. My father knew his name, but he never gave me mine.
Certain of the gains that awaited their students for becoming more civilized the Quaker teachers could not comprehend the losses the children suffered as they became less Indian. Now, to conclude this talk, let me see if I can summarize what I have gathered from the books, articles, letters, and journals of Quaker teachers in the Indian schools. Quakers saw themselves as the reformers of their time. They condemned the government's brutality and dishonesty in its dealings with the Indians and lamented the miserable conditions on the reservations. They called themselves Friends of the Indians, setting themselves apart from their fellow citizens who were urging the U.S. cavalry to exterminate the Western tribes and make the continent safe for manifest destiny. They lived at a time when social Darwinism was becoming a popular way for European Americans to justify the decline of, quote, inferior races and the natural selection of superior ones. Against public opinion that said Native people could not be civilized and would inevitably die out one way or another, the Quakers believed that Native people could be civilized. They could be rescued from their, quote, savage state and become, quote, useful citizens. Quakers realized that this transformation would have to come about through the children. Quaker teachers who started day schools on the reservations quickly lobbied for construction of boarding facilities to keep the children away from the bad influence of their parents and communities. They called the boarding schools homes. They called the residents of those homes, the Indian children and the Quaker staff, families, supplanting the children's Indian families. They gave the children English names and Western clothes, supplanting their native identity. They believed that they were doing this in the very best interests of the individual children and of the entire Indian race. In all my reading, I found only one instance where someone questioned the goal of forcing Native people to abandon their entire way of life and adopt European Christian civilization. In 1897, the Friends Intelligencer published a report by Anna Beecher Scoville, a young teacher of Indian students at the Hampton Institute. She had visited the Sac and Fox people in the West, who, she said, had split apart. The Sacs stayed in Kansas and followed the prescribed path to civilization. The Foxes rejected white civilization, left Kansas, and purchased land in Iowa. Miss Scoville reported,
They rejected the white man's house, the white man's dress, the white man's civilization, the white man's God, and the white man's vices. How have they succeeded? They have lived surrounded by white people, but they have lived as Indians. They have supported themselves, receiving but little money from the government. They have lived carefully and have worked hard in their way, making mats and baskets, weaving and working in silver. The family relation is preserved. They boast that there is not a half-breed under 50 years of age in the band. They earn their living as Indians. They dress as Indians. They speak as Indians. As Indians, they stand and hope to die.
Miss Scoville had gotten a glimpse of a different path to health, happiness, and prosperity, a uniquely Indigenous path. It would take 3/4 of a century for her insight to shift national policy from forced assimilation to self-determination for Native peoples. But Miss Scoville's observations were interpreted very differently at the time. The person she considered the greatest missionary in the region told her that the independent Fox community she had visited was
the most discouraging spot on the face of the earth.
Discouraging, yes, to Christians who believed there was one and only one way to a life of prosperity, health, and happiness, and who wanted to offer those blessings to the next generation of Indians. They could not see that there might be different and equally valid and valuable ways of living, or that Native cultures had intrinsic value. Why not? Because, I think, they held the same assumptions of European Christian superiority that were held by the Americans who were calling for the extermination of Indian people. The Quakers would not kill Indians, but for their own good, they would do their best to exterminate Indianness. Fortunately, they were not successful. Native people have kept 600 unique cultures alive throughout this land. Despite the best efforts of their teachers, 150 native languages are still being spoken, and others are being revived. Robin Kimmerer, who is learning her Potawatomi language for the first time as an adult, says,
"It's almost as if the air is waiting to hear this language that had been lost for so long."
This is one form that healing takes in Native communities. Much healing is needed. The wounds in Native families go back many generations. Through painful testimony and scientific study, we are learning how those wounds have afflicted generation after generation of Native families and continue to do so now in the form of illness, depression, suicide, substance abuse, violence, and poverty. Echoes of the boarding school are present today in the child welfare systems of many states, where Native children are systematically removed from their homes and put into foster care with white families. Discriminatory detention, sentencing, and incarceration practices prevent thousands of Native mothers and fathers from raising their own children. Effectively orphaned, hundreds of Native children are housed in boarding schools run by the Bureau of Indian Education, like the one I visited last year in Anadarko, Oklahoma. Native organizations that are working to heal these wounds need our support. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition invites us to work with them as allies. We can support the coalition as individuals, as churches, as colleges, and as organizations. The first thing they ask of us is to learn the truth and to acknowledge the harm that was done. This is a first step toward healing and right relationship that we can take. As I said at the outset, our purpose in lifting up this history is not to shake our fingers at the Quakers or Catholics or Methodists of past centuries. Our purpose is to know the truth and then hold a mirror to our own faces and ask, who are we today? How can we put ourselves on the right side of history now? This concludes our presentation. In a moment, I'll offer 4 queries for friends to think about as individuals or to discuss in groups. But first, please make a note of our website, where we have posted additional information and links to many online resources. If you'd like to communicate with me directly, I'll be happy to receive email correspondence at this email address. And now I'd like to offer 4 queries, and of course, you may have queries of your own. If you're gathered in a group, it would be very good to follow the Quaker practice of worship sharing. Speak as you are led, sharing what is truest for you. Refrain from crosstalk, discussion, or debate. Be considerate of time constraints. Allow for some silence between speakers to fully take in what each person has said. These are the queries. What does this history mean to you? And more broadly, what does it mean to us as Quakers today? How can Quaker faith and practice help us respond to this history with integrity? In addressing injustices today, how can we avoid making the mistakes our Quaker forefathers and foremothers made? Native people say the first step on the path toward healing is acknowledging the harm that has been done. How can friends take this first step?